Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this panel. The subject is how to regulate GAFAMs and how to arm the states faced with the GAFAMs. I'm going to hand over to Anne, who's going to make a start. Oh, well, I'll introduce the speakers then. That's how we can go about things. So Philippe Corot, next to me, is the CEO of Miracle, which is a French unicorn helping companies to do e-commerce. He's going to tell us about his company. Then we have Professor Lan Shui, who is from the University of Tsinghua in Peking, and his field of expertise focuses on public policies and technologies. He's also going to tell us what's happening in Asia, in China, so that we can have an animated debate. Our third speaker is the General Director of Orange, Christelle Heidemann. So Orange, shall I introduce Orange? Yes? Closer, I need to speak closer to the microphone. So Christelle from Orange is the General Director. So it's the biggest telecom company in France. Orange is in other countries like Spain and Poland. There's Yann Lecan, who is a researcher working in artificial intelligence for Meta. And he's going to be talking to us about that specific scientific field, where he's one of the international leaders in that field. Then we have Sylvain Duranton, who's the World Director of BCGX, that creates software for companies in the field of artificial intelligence and data. And he's in charge of a team of 3,000 people. Then we have Anne Perrault, who is from the Cercle des Économistes, who will be introducing us to the subject. She is a former director in charge of competition. She's familiar with technological regulations. So if everybody can hear me, I can say a few words. I'll say a few words because we've talked we're going to be talking about things that don't necessarily exist. We're going to be talking about regulating artificial intelligence. What do we mean by all of this? Let me just start by reminding you that when digital technologies emerged, we didn't ask ourselves about artificial intelligence, but technologies came and unsettled former business models. Uber, Amazon, distribution circuits. And the question that we asked was, should we bring these new business models into places that were built for other things, for distributors, physical distributors, for example, taxis, or should we create new boxes, new spaces for these new technologies? And thank goodness we said no to both options. We tried to create a level playing field, in other words, a competitive playing field, because the main problem was a problem of competition. Each market targeted by the technology, where the old and new models fought, but had to fight on a level playing field. So this objective was achieved. We can say that taxis and Uber drivers cohabit. It's not always smooth sailing, but we have created a competitive environment where each person, each party is able to cohabit. Now, the difficulty of regulation is that as technologies have developed, we realized that competitive regulations interfered with lots of other regulations applied to digital technology. For example, protection of personal data, labor rights, platform workers. Are they salaried workers, or should we create a new category for platform workers? So again, you know, what about interactions with regulations? That was another question that came up. And the Court of Justice of the European Union recognized the right of Bundeskartellamt, which is the regulation authority. So if the RGPD is not respected, which is outside of the field of competition, and this would be an anti-competitive rule. And Meta was accused of that by the Bundeskartellamt. So these are all old questions. that have led to European regulations, the DSA in terms of digital content and the DMA on competitive regulations, they are all based on the fact that these digital platforms are large-sized, and we all know why. They have fixed costs for technologies. There are very few variable costs, and that, of course, encourages the emergence of big-sized platforms. The problem is that everything goes very fast in this field, and perhaps we're already behind the times. Perhaps we've missed the train, but which train are we talking about? Artificial intelligence is on its way. Artificial intelligence raises problems relating to regulation that we've already encountered. Interoperability, for example. The interoperability of artificial intelligence. I'm talking about that as an outsider, but we're talking about self-learning software based on data. So we're wondering how self-learning software will interact with other self-learning software. What about the data that's accessible? Will it be open data or not? So these are questions of interoperability that we've already talked about when competition in the telecommunications field came to light. And then there are other problems that maybe we haven't anticipated, and that will be the subject of the roundtable. So there is a layer of complexity underlying these questions. Everything is flying away. And that is the international dimension of all of these questions. The United States and Europe are not on the same wavelength when it comes to opening and closing AI software to the public. So again, in fact, for once, it's Europe that's recommending open source solutions, but again, we need to talk about that. And perhaps I should say something else. In all of these digital technologies, the difficulty of regulation is if it comes too early, it blocks innovation. If it's too late, we realize that we've got these mastodonts that can no longer be controlled. This was the case of Google. There are 36 anti-competitive cases against Google, as you probably know. I'll stop there and let the others say something now. So, with respect to the relations between states and these GAFAMs, I think we have to stop being candid. We have to be vigilant when we collaborate. Candid because we're talking about economic objects that are completely, outside of the usual standards. If we take the capitalization of the GAFAMs, we're looking at the GDP of Germany and Japan. So we're talking about objects that are just outsized. And when we look at the ability of investment of these objects, well, President Macron announced 500,000 in investment for them in France. So Microsoft is announcing an investment of 10 billion for OpenAI. So we're talking about huge amounts. Now, to collaborate, to work with the GAFAMs, I think that the first thing is to get rid of some chimera that come from the fact that they have been made to look diabolic, like American powers who have crept up on us unawares. So it's not just a question of American giants, it's a question of giants full stop. So if we go back to the chimera, some are thinking of dismantling. In 1911, the Standard of Rockefeller was dismantled after 10 years of cases. I don't think that this will happen. We saw what happened with Microsoft that continued in a renewed and regulatory environment. And then there's the DSA, the DMA. I think that's probably the path that we'll go down to. Another chimera is, okay, let's close off our frontiers and let's do what China is doing. But that means that we're going to create a local European ecosystem that we would control without knowing who we really are. Who's going to control all of that? I think it's not very likely from a political point of view because it means that we would be moving away from a liberal democracy-based model that defends free trade. So I don't think that will happen unless there's some kind of political cataclysm, and that wouldn't be desirable given what all of these tools and technologies give us. There's another chimera, you know, the idea is let's launch our own competitors, as we did with Quant, to have our research engine in Europe. I think experience shows that it's not easy to say that we're going to do the same and better because we're European, given how these players move forward. So getting away from dismantling, barricading, how do we go about things? Well, the first thing to do is to innovate. With new technologies, we've got American champions. There are the 26 unicorns that make them very proud. And in other areas, we're able to innovate. And that innovation can take an open source form. And when I look at AI and what the teams are doing in AI, everybody's using a lot of open source methods. So that means a huge innovation in terms of open source AI. PyTorch that was made possible thanks to Meta. We might expect that in the new generation for AI, we will have open source models that will help with business models. So we need to move on to the next speaker. So let me just finish my sentence. The other subject with respect to regulations, here we have to get kitted out. We need to be able to negotiate with entities like we negotiate with states. And these are things where governments in Europe are still a bit naive, but we can move out of negotiations very positive. India has a 10 billion investment with Google to help with the digital transition of its local companies. So we mustn't see everything like a battle against devils. There are other things that can be seen as quite virtuous, I believe. Thank you, Sylvain. We're going to move. Thank you, Sylvain. We're going to move on to Jan now. So we need to imagine a future in 10 years or so, perhaps earlier or later, where all of our interactions with the digital world will be via a virtual assistant. Each of us will have a virtual assistant, a bit like, you know, our private staff. They will help us to amplify our intelligence. They will all be CEOs, directors of teams, and our team will be virtual. In this future, these platforms where we're interacting with digital technologies, should these platforms be closed or open? In other words, if we retrieve all of our information, including public opinions via these assistants, is it going to be reasonable for platforms like this that will be depositing repositories of all human data? Is it good for them to be proprietary platforms? The answer to that question is definitely no. We need to imagine a future where the basic AI platforms are open source. This future is coming very quickly. It's already beginning, in fact. And the AI industry will be built above these open source platforms. So it will be, we're talking about business systems, but above open source platforms. A bit like when you're building a motorway or when you put fiber in the ground, you perhaps have one or two fibers. So the basic model will be open source and shared, and that will act as a common infrastructure. And then the market will drive that kind of situation. This is what we've seen already 25 years ago. When internet started, there was a war between Microsoft and Sun Microsystems for the base platform, for the operating system, for the web server, ASP, Java, all of that. They both lost, which meant that today internet is open source. It's Linux, Apache, JavaScript, Chrome, Firefox, etc. that's behind internet. The same thing is going to happen for AI. And the reason for this is that if a platform is shared, it has to be open source for it to progress more quickly. It will federate contributions from across the world. Another reason why these platforms need to be open source is that these systems, these IA systems, are driven. For them to be driven and produce information that is shared across the world, where there is a certain consensus, they have to be driven by millions of people who contribute on a voluntary basis, a bit like with Wikipedia. Now, all of these people will not contribute to a closed platform, so it has to be open source for that very reason. So we're in a transition period at the moment. We've got a choice between deciding that artificial intelligence and technology is too dangerous to remain open, so it needs to be put under lock and key, and it needs to just be in the hands of a small number of companies, or on the contrary, we've got to have open source platforms that call for the contributions not only of European startups, but from across the world, but also from the general public, so that the systems can be driven. And if you like, I'm for option 2. It's also the case of Meta. As Sylvain said, we've been working on open source research for AI, and PyTorch is one of these platforms. The Mavia is another one. It's a model for open, well, it's half open language, but the others will be more open. So the landscape, the competitive landscape for AI is going to be changing in the coming weeks, the coming months. There will be open source platforms that will be as good as the ones today. And that will create industry in Europe. So Meta, with its open source policies, is the objective ally for European sovereignty in the digital world. So I was supposed to be the bad boy on this panel, but I'm not, am I? No, for once. Christelle, it's your turn. Well, first of all, we're talking about the GAFAMs, but behind the GAFAMs, there are very different players, and Jan has just illustrated this by talking about the strategy that is very different from one market player to the next when it comes to AI. But if we look at the mobile universe, Apple versus Android, for example, the world has been divided into two camps, and they're not taking the same approaches. So that's what we're seeing in technology. It's true that when we're operators, when you're called Orange, you have a responsibility towards your customers, and the customers are, we have no sound. So we have that role. We're integrators of technology because we work with all of these platforms. We embed the technology and we wonder what kind of AI technology is going to be used. We're already using AI for more efficient encoding. So we always decide to have several options, and we spend a lot of time looking at economic advantages. Operators are regulated. We are regulated as operators. When you're a mobile operator, the spectrum is the most important resource. It's something that we have to manage, the bandwidth. We have to build networks that are efficient, that work properly, that are able to digest the traffic that is going up and up. The traffic was multiplied by a factor of 10 over the last 5 years, and it will continue to go up 30% a year over the coming years. So there are some real challenges, physical resource challenges. There are technological challenges. We're talking a lot about AI, but then there are computing power challenges. The learning power will require a lot of consumption of energy. And then there are other subjects as operators that we're talking about. We're collaborating. By nature, we are fragmented. Each country has its lot of operators across the world of digital identity and web. We've got a joint venture with Vodafone, Telefonica. It's called UTIC, and the aim is to get rid of cookies. Cookies will be disappearing from the Google world. They will be replaced by something that is your local actor that you will be able to trust. So there's a lot of innovation, and this requires a lot of collaboration with different market players. And with respect to regulations, the difficulty is knowing whether we should have regulations after or before. Things go so fast that it's better to have something beforehand, but it's not, and it's not easy to do it afterwards. In terms of the general protection rules, I think that you know, the temptation to have something that's open source is natural, but it's not easy. So how do we arm our states? As states need to learn, and to learn, they've got to try and test things. And so a regulatory approach in a world that's changed very quickly is complicated. Sometimes regulations are no longer suitable, and this requires working with states, working with regulators, thinking about innovation in the regulation world too. Thank you. So, Lan, over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful symposium. Let me make three quick points. I think the first one is that unlike many of the other countries in the West, I think France, Germany, US, and so on, you have been in the tech lead for many years, and I think that's not the case. China has been a follower and a learner for many years. So I think when it comes to AI, I think China is indeed, I think it's sort of somewhere not too distant from the US and sort of in the frontier. So the Chinese government is very ambivalent about what to do. On the one hand, Chinese government want to promote the development of AI and to use it and to promote efficiency and applications and so on. On the other hand, also China is also aware that indeed there's potential risks and harm might generate if there's no regulation. So that's how do you do that. I think in terms of regulation of this new technology, China is similar to other countries, so there's not a lot of experience in doing so. So China sees this regulation as a learning process of trying to balance the two, development and regulation. And so that's what China has been doing. The second point I'd like to mention is that we have to recognize the uncertainties inherently involved in the technology. So we've actually visited many companies, AI companies and so on. So they basically saying that when there's a new application, and they are also trying to see what's the potential benefits and what are the potential risks. I think the government agencies in the same situation. So in a way, we call this a kind of a mutually ignorance situation we're in. Both the companies and the government agencies, they're both ignorant of some potential risks that's involved. So that really requires a new type of regulation, because in the past, the government is like a cat, the companies are like mouse, and the two are playing a game. But here, you can't play that game anymore. The two really have to communicate, have to work together to identify what are the potential risks and how to mitigate and how to minimize that. So I think that's a new kind of a regulation that we need to get into. But the third point I think is important is that no matter what process you adopt, I think when public safety, when public interest is involved, the government should never be hesitant in using whatever the tools you have to stop the potential risks and the harms, and which actually is what China did in the year 2020 with Alibaba, when the government felt that there were some significant issues being involved, and then there was a very heavy-handed regulation on the big companies. So that's my 3 points. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Philippe, c'est à toi.
Philippe, it's your turn. Hello. So my name is Philippe Corot. I'm CEO of Miracle and co-founder of Miracle. Let me give you a context. Our job at Miracle is to help our customers to set up and implement a platform-based business model, a platform or a marketplace. So it's this business model that has made the Amazon successful and given it strength. That's how Amazon has become the leader in the retail industry. So we provide our customers with weapons, if you like, so that they can fight equally against the GAFAMs. Let me just shed some light on things, and a different kind of light. We've talked a lot about regulations and competition and open source systems. But when we talk about the GAFAMs, apart from Microsoft, we're talking about companies that have seen considerable growth over the past 20 years. So we can ask ourselves, what about these legacy actors, these legacy players? What have they done to finance innovation in their own companies, or even when it comes to investing in other companies? Earlier on, you said that Microsoft is investing 10 billion in open AI. Before doing that, they'd invested 100 million. What company today, belonging to the CAC 40, is going to be able to put 100 million into an innovation project? And I'm talking about technological innovation without knowing the business model ahead of time. You know, we still don't know the business model for artificial intelligence, as you've said. I think it's also a question that we have to ask. What is our ability as a European company to finance innovation, just like China is doing and the United States? And, you know, rather than just talking about regulation, because these digital giants, they weren't born in a specific place. They were startups to begin with, like us. And as startups, the difficulty I have convincing certain prospective customers of the suitability of developing a platform business model in order to compete with Amazon. I know what that difficulty is like. I've met customers and some of those customers disappeared. They haven't been able to adapt. This was 10 years ago. So it's the ability of companies to adapt, to change, so that other competitors that are huge can emerge and eat them up in their legacy fields. We've talked about open source models, the open source models of Meta. I don't know what's going to happen there, but artificial intelligence will be based on open source models. Today, I think that AIs are strategic, national or European challenges. Today, we're not dealing with that. We're dealing with it at European level with regulations. We're saying that, okay, we're going to not favor European companies that either want to use AI platforms or who want to emerge with new AI platforms, because the open source model is a good model. It's proven its worth in lots of technological fields, but it's not the only model. We can see that there are many software programs that are not open source, and the platforms that use open source models are, by definition, WVS, for example, they're not open source. So my only point
to remind you, bear in mind the importance for French European companies, the need to innovate, to finance innovation, and not be scared to invest as Microsoft did, $100 million, which is, you know, which all companies can do, you know, on in innovation project to foster the advent of future European GAFAMs. Thank you. So let's kick off the discussion about this notion of artificial intelligence, AI, which is, let's start with a question to Jan. Do you think the advent of quick technologies, I mean, is it going to make the regulatory framework, which exists today in Europe and the US, will it make it obsolete? Do we need to find new ways of working? Well, in a certain way, yes. In another way, no. There will be improvements in technology and progress. There are two types of regulation. One which has to do with the product put on the market, and of course, we need authorization to commercialize and regulations for automatic driving, autonomous cars, medical diagnostic support. So they exist. We just need to adapt the existing regulation to get the authorization, marketing, you know, to test the reliability of this. And then another question, the regulation of research, development, and which are upstream. And any regulation, of course, will be counterproductive or obsolete very rapidly. So because technology evolves very rapidly. So either the regulation will regulate nothing, or will regulate too much, or will regulate the wrong things, and will be useless. So I do believe that the principle of precautions would consist in minimizing regulation. So if I'm back to the notion of the world upside down, when we talk to the US government is strongly, significantly influenced by some of the companies who would like AI to be sort of black boxed. But when you talk to the French government, on the contrary, the French government would like to an open source approach, which would be a chance for Europe to remain in the race, and they're against the regulation. So it's kind of a, for Europe is against regulation. Well, European government, but European governments are against regulations and in favor of business, and the American government, in fact, is trying to see how to regulate that. Christelle, do you have a view on that? Is regulation a tipping point because of AI? I don't know if it is about AI, but I'd like to come back to what's just been said about the CAC 40 companies. I'm one. At Orange, we invest more than 7 billion per year in telecom infrastructure and more than 8 billion a year in innovation. So next question is, where will we invest? So what we don't do enough maybe to have a focused challenges or bets on some focused topic. We can't do things alone. We can't go it alone. So it depends on the ecosystem. Bets on innovation, we do that. Some don't work. If you want to innovate, you have to accept to fail once in a while. So we do a lot of bets, but sometimes it's not the good one. But then it's our ability, where some of our competitors are no longer in the public or in stock because there are massive investment problems. In Europe, there is a problem with regulation about the utilization of the network, because today, more than 55% of traffic in networks, why we do have to invest 7 billion per year, is consumed by 5 platforms, including TikTok. They're not all Americans. So should we keep putting this money for the few platforms, or should we more aware of the traffic we generate on the network, because maybe we should use that money for innovation, for different challenges. So regulation could help in some cases, and let me take the case of Netflix. And we all are happy to be Netflix partner, but initially when we distributed in France, they paid for the network because they had to pay for the network. But since we're a very fragmented market in the contracts today, we no longer invoice the transport because other operators don't do it. So this is where regulation, we back to the competitive market. This is what the Digital Market Act should allow or enable, and some companies will enter this Digital Market Act, which will aim at managing platforms which have such critical sizes that they could become impediment to innovation. So yes, we need innovation. For the AI, I would rather say that yes, we have to be cautious, but we cannot say that we need to learn. There are some challenges around AI, but if we put regulation project we've seen at the European project, well, we know it will penalize innovation. That's certain. No, maybe. No, now reverse the question. Now let's reverse the question. We talked before the panel. We talked, Philippe, about the fact that regulation has a cost for a company like Miracle, because you got jobs which are not doing very value-added jobs. So, what's the daily life of regulation in your business? Well, first, you have to know that new regulations crop up every year. Every year, we've got the LGBT, DSA, DMA, you name it, we've got the AI Act, Data Act, and so on and so forth. Every year. We, today, at Miracle, we got between 15 and 25% of our R&D mobilized on topics of compliance and not on topics of innovation, which means basically a quarter of our technical teams, of our developers, will develop topics which are not interesting, which are associated with regulation, highly complex, often even when we ask questions. precise question when we ask our people who created those regulations, as we did in the European Commission a couple of weeks ago. Well, they cannot provide the answer. It's so complicated or complex that even they don't understand it. So, you know, we can see that this complexity is damaging us. You know, it's damaging my I would rather have my technicians working into innovation rather than developing new regulations or adapting to regulations. Even okay, fair. Regulation is important. I know that it's to innovate for any common business activity. It's essential to have a regulated environment. It's not anarchy, but what's good as well is those rules should apply to all. Today we can see that, to get back to the example of Netflix, that was the base of the neutrality of the net. The flaws are free, you know. So, but it's true, it's easier for large companies to adapt themselves to the regulation than it is easier for large ones than small ones. So, and the risk with that, with strong regulation, too strong a regulation, you kill the startups when they start. Well, maybe, yeah, regulation is needed. It is an issue. Don't go too far on AI. We could block everything. But there is a different approach, which is the labeling. You know, for example, the responsible utilization with AI. There are labels developed, one in France. We worked with Orange to Positive AI with L'Oréal and Manacor Frederic. We, you know, by pulling our best practices, not waiting for the regulators to tell us what we have to do, and even for us, you know, move on with what to do. And for all companies who want to join the label, well, to be certified, you know. So I think we should not count only on the state. Companies do a lot, you know, they share what they do to recreate trust vis-à-vis consumers. Maybe a question that's going to upset some of you. Well, on AI, do you think that we need new institutions on international framework on this issue that do not exist today? So maybe first, land first.
Okay. Yeah, let me try. I think, first of all, I think that, as you know, we've already heard that, you know, we want to maintain both innovation and also we want to have the regulation to make sure that the innovation can, you know, move along a healthy path. I think to balance the two, I think the one thing that we need to think about, how do we change the way we regulate? I think the traditional way of regulating an industry is that we actually have to develop a, you know, a set of sort of regulatory framework and, you know, doing the cost-benefit analysis and going through the political process and then make that into a law or, you know, whatever the principle. I think that technology, that kind of governance is no longer, you know, applicable here in the AI development. As Jan has already said, technology moves very fast. So what we call the so-called pacing problem. The technology moves very fast, the regulation moves very slow. So if you want to use the traditional way, then you're never going to catch it. And that's the kind of situation that, you know, Philip just talked about. You know, you spend 25% of the cost on the compliance because those regulations probably were developed 10 years ago. Couldn't really keep up with the technology. So what really needed, what I think, you know, we've been advocating is a so-called agile governance. That is, you know, the governance has to move fast. You don't have to go through the traditional approach. And so you try to have some light measures to nudge the company if they're moving in the wrong direction. And that's the kind of, you know, approach that the government should really try to learn. I think that's sort of one thing we you know, advocate. The second thing is also, I think the companies themselves also have to try to think about how to work together to develop the best practice, to develop some industrial standards so that actually when those can be applied, that's going to benefit everybody in the industry. So you don't have to necessarily have to have the government heavy-handed. You know, that certainly is very high cost, as in, you know, in China's case, Alibaba has certainly felt that. So I think that kind of leading companies should really play that leading role. And that's what I think we should try to promote.
Quelqu'un d'autre?
Who would like to respond to that? I think Philippe is quite speechless. Plus minus one, minus one, plus one. If we create a institution, you have to remove one. You know, I mean, no. I'm not an expert, but of course we say that there is every year we add things. We have merger corporations. We have means to interact with all the institutions. The reality is that in these domains in Europe, we want to be innovative. We create barrier at the entry. So there is a challenge to say that we have to remain to something which is feasible for the business model and the entrepreneurs. No, let's not add, well, a new institution. I mean, it's complicated already between what happens at the European level and what happens at the national level. We can see contradictions in the way we will implement some regulations. So if we add another regulation authority, they know how to be creative when it comes to regulation. So at least not on evolution regulation, they know how to do it. So we would rather be peaceful. So what do you think? Because you are the heart of the reactor. There's been requests from creation of supranational entities, but the motivation came from the idea that the AI is intrinsically dangerous for mankind. So those people who think that a super smart AI will come soon, and there are risk of, destroying mankind. So we need supranational entities. Those are the same people who ask for drastic regulations because of such danger. I don't believe in such dangers. I believe that they are easily can be easily mitigated. So as a function of the view we have, we could be for or against the regulation. So community in favor of such regulation, which believe in long-term danger for extinguishing of humankind because of AI, is very limited, vocal and powerful, and especially in the Silicon Valley, people who have a lot of money, and they create think tanks and entities to ponder that. They publish their views on all possible networks, social networks, but the huge majority of the business community and academic research do not believe in that. So we should not take such opinions as being the majority, the minority, even though they count among their advocates, some of my close friends and researchers. Do we have questions from the audience? And how do we deal with the questions? We have microphones. Hello. Hello, Zanza. I have a question concerning the weapons for Europe. You know, I mean, we see that regulation. We're strong in regulation. What about the alternative solutions? We are far from proposing good solutions. So bearing in mind that the capital is available, but is poorly routed. So is the battle already lost? Has the battle already been lost? No. In Europe, we have one thing which is most difficult to construct from zero, is this talent. We got a great education system. We know in France, we know how to educate engineers, IT experts, mathematicians. Those are the basic methods for AI. So we have everything we need for that. Now, just to give you an example, the LLM, the meta system, which came in open source a few months ago, called Llama, well, there are 14 authors, 11 of them are French and based in Paris. So 2 left to do a startup called Mistral. They snapped their fingers and they got 100 million investment. So we got 100 million sometimes. So there are talents in France and Europe. And what we need is indeed access to money, people who could accept to take risk. For the researcher, it is access to computing power, because the academic world is lagging behind the industry. The industry has huge means for computing. They spend, companies like Meta, Google, or Microsoft, they spend like you know, like a billion a year just for computation infrastructure for AI alone. There is no equivalent in Europe, and then we should be able to give this to the researchers who will not have means to raise money like that. So the French government is investing something like 500 million in this kind of action, but it's not enough. So maybe one thing, because there is the battle already lost. I would say, what battle? Because we talk a lot about real or supposed battle of people of digital. The true battle for France, for Europe, for the jobs, for the economy is that our major corporations should shift into the AI. We know if we want to be the leader on the market, and because of the importance of the technology, we have to be leader and be able to deploy the technology. It will irrigate all the SMEs ecosystem. All this battle, I think, is much more important than the battle of knowing where is the model or such question. And this battle, I think, we don't talk about it enough, and that's a true economic driver for our economies. It's true. There was a McKinsey study on generative regenerative AI, and that the economic potential between 17 and 25,000 billion US dollar. And I think Europe cannot ignore it. So, and of course, Mistral is a great example. I know the topic of Mistral was financed by business angels and by an investment fund, but not by companies we talked about earlier on. Time for another question, possibly? No microphone? Yes? Hello? Goël, Technical Director for an AI startup. So, I'm here. I'd like you to develop your vision on the opening of AI. You justified it for the intelligence model, but can you develop about the two other aspects of AI, which is data and the storage and infrastructures, which are concentrated around the GAFAM, and which is where it is more complicated to open and to think about the role of Europe? Well, Europe and France specifically should have startups, and the academic world should have also computation power. The government, US government has done that. France is slightly ahead with the Jean Z computer, which has been partly financed by Meta and Facebook at the time. So it is important. So, and also for the startups, because it calls for a lot of means, to run such models. Now, if we go into history where models, the basic model will be open source, they do cost a lot of money to adjust them and to do specific application on the top of that. It is less expensive in calculation. So I think it's a good means to escape the cost, the major computation cost. And for data, what's complicated is well, for the time being, the only country in the world which is a paradise for machine learning is Japan. If you train a model with public data, we won't sue you for copyrights. So in the US, for the time being, in Europe it's still floating, but in the US, everybody is suing everybody else. People who had content are suing those who are running models by saying, you cannot use our data, they're public, and then several platforms which used to be public, now they are public data, they shut it down, like Twitter, Edit, or others. So it will make things more complicated to run the big models. And there is some kind of a void or in terms of regulation that will need to be solved rapidly instead of spending billions with lawyers. One last question here, but very quickly, please, very quickly. Thank you. Hello. My question is to you, Mr. Houquet. You have a very positive vision of the global impact of AI on mankind. Now, don't you think that you have a sort of a complacency bias because you live in a world where intelligence is filtered? No, what I do believe is that AI will amplify human intelligence. If we got AI assistant who are smarter than us, work for us, it's like having an assistant, in your staff, in business or in research. Our purpose is to employ people who are smarter than us, because you shouldn't feel threatened by working with artificial entities who would be smarter than us. AI will be an amplifier of intelligence, and that's obvious. It's the commodity that's missing most intelligence. So now, of course, the type of power can you put to the service of people who are ill-minded, bad, but we can hope that there will be more people with good intentions and who also have access to AI, who have more means than people with bad intentions. What we forget often today that there are people who use AI already in a simplified way to try to impact the elections or disseminate fake news, to disseminate terrorist propaganda, or the hate speeches or pedophilic things. But the best protection against all that in social networks is AI. For example, the proportion of heinous speech, hate speech, removed by AI was about 25% 20 years ago. Last year it was 95%. It results from the recent improvement of AI intelligence used by ChatGPT and others. No microphone, no translation. The AI makes it possible to erase cultural barriers and enable people to speak in their own language. So there are people who do vocal recognition, voice recognition in more than 1,000 languages. So a translation system that can translate 100 languages in any direction. But that will enable people to use their culture and their language without having to recourse to learn, the language of the. We use such system with Wikipedia to translate to automatically translate Wikipedia pages. So on the contrary, AI will provide integration. We have to stop. I hope the discussion was interesting for everybody. Thank you to all speakers.